We're diving into some heavy stuff today, listener. The recent fires in Los Angeles were absolutely devastating, and the images and stories coming out are just, uh, they're hard to process. But what struck me even more than the immediate tragedy were some of the reactions I saw. Almost a sense of detachment from the human cost, you know?
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and the piece we're exploring today, A Nation Divided in Tragedy, it gets right to the heart of it. It asks this question: why, when confronted with such widespread suffering, does the focus often shift away from the individuals and the families who are actually impacted?
Right from the start, the author argues that these fires, they didn't just destroy physical structures, they shattered what they call the bonds of community.
Yeah.
You think that's just poetic language? Or is there a real tangible impact when those connections are severed?
Oh, it's far more than just poetic language. Imagine for a moment you're not just losing your home, your entire support system vanishes overnight. Your neighbors, the familiar faces at the local store, even that friend you'd bump into at the park every morning, gone.
And the piece highlights how this impact is even more devastating for certain groups, especially the elderly.
Absolutely. For many elderly residents, these communities weren't just homes, they were intricately woven into their entire support systems. Someone who's 80 years old might have lived in the same neighborhood for decades, relying on a familiar network of friends, neighbors, local businesses, and then suddenly that's gone. Imagine trying to rebuild those connections, that sense of security at that age. It's a monumental task, and one that often gets overlooked in the rush to rebuild infrastructure.
The article specifically mentions Altadena, California, as an example. I have to admit, I wasn't very familiar with its history.
Altadena is a fascinating case study. It has this rich history, especially for Black families. You see, back in the day, it was a refuge from redlining, a place where Black families could build lives and thrive despite the discriminatory housing practices of the time. Over the years, it produced influential figures in so many fields: artists, activists, educators. It's a community with deep roots.
And yet, the piece argues that even with this rich history, its destruction hasn't received the attention it deserves. What's behind that discrepancy?
That's where the author's point about systemic neglect comes in. Even in the face of tragedy, the burden isn't shared equally. Some communities are more visible, their suffering more acknowledged than others. Why is that? Is it a matter of media coverage, of existing societal biases, or a combination of factors that render certain communities and their struggles essentially invisible?
It's interesting because the author then goes into a very personal reflection about their own parents. They talk about how their parents lived through incredible hardship, but always instilled the values of unity and compassion in their children. It feels like they're drawing a sharp contrast between that upbringing and what they see happening today.
It's a striking juxtaposition. The author seems to be wrestling with this question: how did we as a nation go from a place where unity and compassion were core values to a place where division and apathy seem to be taking root?
And the author's very clear that it isn't just theoretical. They describe a deep and pervasive hatred fueling the divides in our country. It's a very strong statement.
It is, and what's particularly troubling is the author's observation that even in the face of these shared catastrophes like the fires, these divisions are amplified, not diminished. Instead of coming together, we're pulling further apart, retreating into our own echo chambers of blame and resentment. It begs the question: how did we reach this point where even shared suffering can't bridge the gap?
It's easy to get overwhelmed by the scale of this, by the sheer magnitude of the problems the author lays out. But there's also this thread of hope woven through the piece. This belief in the power of individual action to counter those forces of division and apathy.
Yeah, the author specifically talks about being the hands that lift them up. I found that to be such a powerful image. It's not just about donating money or sending thoughts and prayers. It's about actively engaging with the problem, with the people affected, with that urge to do something.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction. It's about taking those feelings of empathy and turning them into concrete action. But what does that look like on a practical level? I mean, where do you even start?
Well, I think the first step is recognizing that action can take many forms. For some, it might be donating to relief efforts or volunteering their time for others. It might be using their platform to amplify the voices of those impacted to counter the invisibility we talked about earlier. And for others, it might simply be having difficult conversations with family and friends, challenging those ingrained biases that perpetuate these systemic problems.
So it's not just about grand gestures. It's about recognizing that even small acts of compassion, of understanding, can contribute to a larger shift.
Exactly. It's about shifting the mindset from "this is too big for me to make a difference" to "what's one small thing I can do today to contribute to a solution?" because those individual actions multiplied across thousands, millions of people can create a ripple effect that starts to dismantle those walls of apathy and division the author describes.
And the author then connects this back to the idea of rebuilding not just physical structures, but those bridges we talked about earlier, rebuilding trust, a sense of shared purpose. It sounds idealistic, almost impossible in our current climate.
It's definitely a challenge, but the author seems to believe that it's not only possible, but absolutely necessary. They present a choice. We either succumb to the cynicism and division that surrounds us, or we actively choose to build a more compassionate, unified future. And the way we rebuild after these tragedies, how we choose to engage with those who are different from us, those choices will reveal which path we're truly committed to.
There's this really interesting part where the author asks, who are we as a nation?
Yeah.
It's almost like they're forcing us to confront our own national identity, our values.
Yeah, that question has been debated for centuries, and it's especially relevant in the context of this piece. Are we a nation that prioritizes individualism above all else, or are we a nation that believes in collective responsibility and caring for one another, even when it's hard, even when it requires us to look beyond our own immediate needs?
And the answer to that question will shape how we respond to these kinds of tragedies in the future.
Absolutely. If we see ourselves primarily as isolated individuals, then it's easy to turn away from the suffering of others, to rationalize inaction, to prioritize our own comfort over collective well-being. But if we see ourselves as part of a larger community, interconnected and interdependent, then we have a moral obligation to help those in need, to recognize that their suffering is our suffering. Their struggles are our struggles.
It makes me think of all those stories you hear in the aftermath of disasters. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers, offering support, communities rallying together to rebuild. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, that human instinct for connection, for compassion, it's still there.
Those stories are so powerful because they offer a glimpse of what's possible when we tap into that shared humanity, that innate desire to help one another. They remind us that we're not as divided as we sometimes feel, that beneath the surface of political debates and social media echo chambers, there's a common thread of empathy and resilience that binds us together.
And that even small acts of kindness, like those we talked about earlier, can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same, creating a chain reaction of compassion that can start to mend those fractured connections.
It's like that old saying, a single candle can illuminate the darkest room. Each act of compassion, no matter how small, pushes back against the darkness, bringing us closer together, reminding us that we're not alone in this fight.
So getting back to that practical level, what are some concrete steps our listeners can take to start building those bridges, to put those feelings of empathy into action?
I think the first step is often the hardest, truly listening to the stories of those who have been affected by these tragedies, trying to understand their experiences, their struggles, their perspectives, and listening without judgment, without trying to impose our own solutions or worldviews.
So it's about creating a space for empathy and understanding rather than just jumping in with our own preconceived notions.
Exactly. And then from that foundation of understanding, we can start to think about concrete ways to help. It might be donating to relief efforts, volunteering our time, or even just offering a listening ear to someone who's struggling. It might be using our voices to speak out against injustice, to challenge those systems that perpetuate inequality. It might be having those difficult conversations with family and friends, challenging those ingrained biases that keep us divided. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but the key is to approach these issues with empathy, with willingness to learn, and with a commitment to action, however small it may seem.
It sounds like a lot of work, to be honest, especially when you consider the scale of the problems we're talking about.
It is a lot of work, but it's the kind of work that's essential if we want to create a more just and compassionate world, and it's work that we can all do, in our own way, no matter who we are or where we come from.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that we're all in this together, and that the choices we make both individually and collectively have the power to shape the future.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems, and get caught up in the negativity, that sense that things are just falling apart.
It really is, especially when we're confronted with those images of devastation and the stark reality of how divided we seem to be. I catch myself doing it sometimes.
Yeah, it's a natural reaction. But what struck me about this piece is that it's not just a lament, a chronicle of despair. The author seems to genuinely believe in the power of community and resilience, our ability to rebuild and heal even from the most devastating blows.
You're right, there's this strong thread of hope running through the whole piece. They don't just leave us wallowing in the darkness, they offer a path forward, a way to claim that sense of unity and compassion we were talking about earlier. One line that really stuck with me was, "Let us not forget those who have been made invisible." What do you think the author means by that?
I think it's a call to action, a reminder that true rebuilding, true healing can't happen until we acknowledge those whose voices are often marginalized or overlooked, especially in times of crisis. It's about making sure everyone's story is heard, everyone's pain is acknowledged, everyone's needs are considered. It's about shining a light on those who might otherwise be left behind in the shadows.
It's about recognizing that everyone's story matters, and that until everyone has a seat at the table, the rebuilding process will always be incomplete.
Precisely. And it's not just about individual stories. It's about challenging those larger systems and structures that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
Yeah.
The author is urging us to go beyond simply putting bandages on the wounds to actually address the underlying infection, those root causes that create the conditions for these kinds of tragedies to disproportionately impact certain communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with? What's that seed you want to plant that might inspire them to take action?
For me, it all comes back to the idea that each of us has a role to play in building a more compassionate and unified future. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy. It's an ongoing process that requires effort and commitment from all of us, a willingness to step outside our comfort zones, to challenge our own assumptions, and to embrace the messiness of the work.
And it's about understanding that this isn't some abstract concept, some far-off goal. It's about those everyday choices we make, those small acts of kindness, those moments where we choose empathy over apathy, understanding over judgment.
Absolutely. It starts with listening to each other, learning from each other, and supporting each other. It starts with recognizing that we're all in this together, that our fates are intertwined, and that we have the power to create a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and connected.
A world where tragedy, while inevitable, doesn't have to define us. A world where we can face challenges together with empathy and resilience.
That's the world I want to live in, and I truly believe it's the world the author of this piece is urging us to create.
It's a powerful message, and one that gives me hope. So listener, as we leave you with this final thought, we encourage you to reflect on what you've heard today and consider your own role in this journey.
What steps will you take, no matter how small, to build bridges, foster unity, and cultivate compassion in your own life and community?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better tomorrow.
And never underestimate the power of hope. Even in the face of tragedy, we can do this together.